Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of Netflix and its pretty unique company culture.
Interesting.
Yeah, so our source material for this deep dive is No Rules, Rules, Netflix, and the Culture of Reinvention.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's a really fascinating look at the philosophies that kind of fuel Netflix's success.
Yeah,
We all know Netflix for its amazing shows, but what makes their workplace tick? That's what we're going to be looking at today.
for sure. And I think there's a lot we can all learn from them, no matter what field we're in.
Exactly. So let's just jump right in.
Okay.
One of the first things that really stood out to me in the book was their intense focus on something they call stunning colleagues.
Right.
It's like they're putting together this all-star team, but for business. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, their whole philosophy is that a team of exceptional individuals actually elevates everyone's game.
Okay, so like the whole team gets better because of these really talented individuals.
Yeah, exactly. It leads to way better results.
Makes sense.
And it's not even just about individual talent, but about how all that talent interacts and kind of feeds off each other within a team.
Interesting.
There's actually this story in the book about how Netflix's performance just skyrocketed after a round of layoffs back in 2001.
Layoffs, isn't that usually a sign that a company is struggling?
Yeah, you'd think so.
It seems counterintuitive.
It is, but these layoffs, even though they were obviously difficult, allowed Netflix to really focus on their top performers.
It's like doubling down on the best of the best.
Exactly. And the remaining team, they were already super high performing, got even more energized by this shared drive to excel.
Okay.
The book also mentions this thing called the rock star principle. It's based on research that shows the best software programmers can be up to 25 times more productive than average ones.
Wow, 25 times. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And it really reinforces Netflix's belief that just a few rock stars can outperform a larger group of average performers.
I mean, that makes you wonder, though, what's the cost of trying to maintain a team of only rock stars? It seems like it would be pretty difficult and maybe even expensive.
That's a great question, and we'll definitely dig into some of the potential downsides of this approach a bit later on. But for now, let's move on to another interesting part of their culture.
Okay, what's that?
Their emphasis on candor.
Candor.
Yeah, Netflix actually encourages radical honesty and open feedback as part of their company culture.
I can see how that could go wrong pretty easily.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that just create a really hostile environment?
Yeah, you'd think so, but they actually have this framework for making it work.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the book outlines what they call the 4 A's of feedback. So feedback should aim to assist.
Okay, aim to assist.
Right? Be actionable and be appreciated.
So the person receiving the feedback should appreciate it.
Yeah, and the recipient should have the freedom to either accept or discard it.
So it's not about forcing your opinion on someone, but giving them something constructive to consider.
Exactly. And they even use this phrase, no brilliant jerks. Basically saying that being brilliant isn't an excuse to be disrespectful or unhelpful.
So it's more about being constructive than just being brutally honest.
Right.
I see. So they put a lot of thought into creating a culture where people can handle that level of directness.
Yeah, and to further reinforce that trust and autonomy, Netflix famously got rid of traditional vacation policies and expense reports.
Wait, no vacation policy. I have to admit, I'm having a hard time understanding that one. How could that possibly work? Wouldn't people just take advantage of it?
Well, it all comes down to their high level of trust in their employees. The book even tells this funny anecdote about a Netflix finance executive who felt embarrassed because he was the only one in economy class.
Really?
Yeah, everyone else was comfortably in first class.
Wow.
So even though they don't have strict rules, there's definitely this understanding of what's considered, reasonable and appropriate.
I see. So it's more about a shared understanding of responsibility rather than a bunch of rules.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about setting clear expectations and context instead of relying on all these rigid policies.
That makes sense. But what about when those decisions, when things don't work out?
Well, that's where another really interesting part of their culture comes in. It's called sunshining their failures.
Sunshining their failures. That sounds kind of strange.
I know, right? But it basically means being open and transparent about your mistakes, sharing them with your colleagues, and talking about what you learned from them.
So it's about turning those negative experiences into learning opportunities for everyone.
Exactly. They believe that by being open about their failures, people will be more comfortable taking risks and trying new things.
I guess that makes sense. If you're not afraid to fail,
Hmm.
you're more likely to try something bold and innovative.
Exactly. The book actually gives a great example of this with the Explorer project.
What was that?
So it was this project where they were trying to create a new interface for streaming Netflix on the Wii console.
Oh, interesting.
They put a lot of time and resources into it, but when they tested it with users, it was a total flop.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Right. In most companies, that kind of failure would be swept under the rug and never spoken of again.
Yeah, I could see that happening.
But at Netflix, the project lead, his name was Chris, he actually presented the failed project at a quarterly meeting.
Wow, that's brave.
Right. He openly discussed the mistakes they made and the lessons they learned from the whole experience.
That must have taken a lot of guts.
It did. But instead of being punished or criticized, he was actually applauded for his transparency.
That's amazing. It sounds like they really walk the walk when it comes to their values.
They do. And this kind of open discussion about failures creates a culture where people feel safe to experiment and learn from their mistakes, which is so important for innovation.
It definitely makes sense. If you create a culture where mistakes are punished, people are just going to try to avoid them at all costs, which
Yeah.
means they're probably not going to be very innovative.
Exactly. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of Netflix's culture is something called the keeper test.
Okay, this sounds intense. What's the keeper test?
So it's this simple but really powerful question that managers regularly ask themselves. If this person quit tomorrow, would I fight to keep them?
Entity.
If the answer is no, the book suggests that managers should actually let that employee go, even if they're a good performer on paper.
Whoa, hold on a second. That sounds incredibly harsh. Wouldn't that create a constant sense of anxiety and fear among employees? Like everyone would be walking on eggshells worried about losing their jobs?
Yeah, you can see how it could be perceived that way. But the book argues that this approach, while it might seem ruthless, actually helps create a culture of high performance and continuous improvement.
How so?
Well, it forces managers to be really honest about who their top performers are, and it encourages everyone to constantly strive for excellence because they know that their job security depends on it.
But couldn't that also lead to a lot of talented people being let go just because they're not perceived as the absolute best? Like, what if someone is really good at their job, but they just don't happen to be a rock star?
That's a really good point, and it definitely highlights the importance of having a clear understanding of what a keeper actually looks like in the context of that specific company.
Right, because keeper probably means something different at Netflix than it does at, say, a small family-owned business.
Exactly. And it also raises questions about how to apply this keeper test fairly and objectively, which is something we can dig into a bit more later.
For sure. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about individual performance and accountability, but what about decision making? How does that work at Netflix?
This is where things get really interesting. Netflix actually believes in empowering employees at all levels to make decisions, even big ones, without needing approval from their bosses.
Wait, seriously? So, like, even junior employees could greenlight major projects without getting permission from anyone higher up? That seems incredibly risky. How do they prevent costly mistakes from happening?
It's not like they just give people free rein and hope for the best. They have this thing called the informed captain model.
Okay, what's that?
It basically means that employers are given a lot of autonomy over their areas of responsibility, but they're expected to gather input from different sources, think critically about the potential risks and rewards, and clearly communicate their decisions to everyone involved.
So it's not about just throwing decisions out there randomly.
Yeah.
There's a structure and a sense of responsibility that goes along with that freedom.
Precisely. It's like they're trusted to be captains of their own ships, but they need to make informed decisions based on careful consideration and open communication.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. It seems like everything at Netflix comes back to these core values of trust, autonomy, and radical transparency.
You're absolutely right. Those are the pillars of their entire culture.
Interesting. But all of this has been about the internal workings of Netflix. How does this unique culture translate when they expand globally?
That's where things get really interesting. As Netflix started expanding into new markets all over the world, they had to figure out how to adapt their culture to all these different cultural contexts.
Right, because what works in one country might not work in another.
Exactly. Different cultures have very different norms and expectations, so they've had to learn to be more culturally sensitive while still staying true to their core values.
That sounds like a delicate balancing act. Can you give me an example of how they've had to adapt?
Sure. One example is their experience in Japan. The culture in Japan is much more indirect, especially when it comes to giving feedback. So their typical approach of radical candor didn't really translate well at first.
So how did they adjust?
They had to find a way to balance their commitment to honesty with the Japanese cultural norm of avoiding direct confrontation.
So what did they do?
They started using more formal feedback sessions and framing their comments in a way that was constructive and respectful rather than just being blunt.
So it's about being mindful of those cultural nuances while still trying to maintain those core values.
Exactly. They've had to learn to be more flexible and adapt their approach based on the specific cultural context they're operating in.
I can imagine there's a lot of potential for missteps along the way, especially when you're dealing with so many different cultures.
Absolutely. And the book actually talks about a situation in Turkey where they had this major PR nightmare.
Oh no, what happened?
They launched this marketing campaign for the show Black Mirror, and it totally backfired.
What did they do?
They were sending these direct messages to users on a popular Turkish social media platform, and the messages were supposed to be creepy and unsettling.
Kind of like the show itself.
Right. But some of the messages included phrases like, "We know what you're up to," and "watch and see what we will do."
Ooh, I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah,
That sounds
well-
pretty threatening.
Yeah, it was a huge miscalculation. The messages were perceived as super invasive and threatening, and it sparked this massive backlash on social media.
Yikes, that's a PR nightmare for sure. So how did Netflix handle it? Did they try to sweep it under the rug?
Nope, they actually did the opposite. They took full responsibility, issued a public apology, and explained that their intention was just to generate some buzz, but they realized they had completely crossed a line.
Okay, that's good. They owned up to their mistake.
Yeah, and what's even more surprising is that they didn't fire or punish the employees who were responsible for the campaign.
Really, that's not what I would have expected. In a lot of companies, someone would have been fired for that kind of mistake.
Right. But Netflix recognized that the mistake was really a result of their own company culture, which encourages these kind of bold and unconventional marketing tactics.
So they saw it as a learning opportunity.
Exactly. They used it as a chance to really examine their own cultural assumptions and adapt their approach for different markets.
That's actually pretty impressive. It shows a real commitment to their values, even in the face of a major crisis.
It does. So even though they made a big mistake, they still held true to their principles of transparency and learning from their mistakes.
All of this is so insightful, but I can't help but wonder, is the Netflix way really sustainable for other companies? I mean, they've obviously been incredibly successful, but they've also faced a lot of criticism. Is this model something that other companies can replicate, or is it just unique to Netflix and their particular situation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's definitely something we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
The book actually acknowledges that this kind of intense high-performance culture isn't for every company or every industry.
It makes sense.
It needs the right environment, the right kind of people.
So what are some of the potential downsides? Like, if someone's out there thinking, hey, the Netflix way sounds pretty good, what do they need to be aware of? Well, one of the biggest criticisms is the potential for burnout.
Burnout, yeah.
You know, it's a very demanding environment.
Always having to be a keeper.
Yeah, that constant pressure to perform, the fear of being let go, it can create a ton of stress and anxiety.
Right, you're always looking over your shoulder.
And another criticism is that the lack of clear rules and guidelines can sometimes lead to ambiguity.
Too much freedom.
Yeah, some people really thrive in environments that have more structure, more predictability.
So it's about finding that right balance.
Exactly. And you have to remember that Netflix operates in this fast-paced creative industry where taking risks is rewarded.
It's a part of their DNA.
Right. And this no-rules approach, it might not work as well in, say, healthcare or finance, where things are much more regulated.
You need different rules for different games.
And then there's the question of the keeper test, you know, the one we talked about before.
Right, that whole would you fight to keep them thing.
Some people argue that it could lead to bias, even if it's designed to keep the talent bar high.
Because it's so subjective.
Exactly. And the book does emphasize that managers need to be super self-aware when applying this test.
To avoid any kind of unconscious bias creeping in.
Yeah, they have to be able to define what a keeper really means for their team.
In a fair and objective way.
Right. It's a powerful tool, but it can be misused.
It's like a sharp knife. Useful, but potentially dangerous.
But despite all these potential downsides, you can't deny Netflix has been wildly successful.
Yeah. They've completely revolutionized the entertainment industry.
So there are definitely valuable lessons to be learned from them, even if you don't adopt their whole playbook.
Right. It's about taking inspiration and adapting it to your own situation.
Exactly. The core takeaway, in my opinion, is their focus on leading with context, not control.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
It's about empowering your team, giving them a clear understanding of the company's goals, and trusting them to make the right decisions.
Rather than micromanaging every little detail.
Right. Give them the why, not just the what.
So they feel ownership and responsibility.
And that can lead to amazing results, you know? People feel more engaged, more motivated.
Wow, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into Netflix and their rather unconventional approach to company culture.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, it really makes you question some of those traditional assumptions about management.
It does. And whether or not you agree with everything they do, you have to admire their boldness, their willingness to experiment.
They're not afraid to shake things up.
And that's something we can all learn from, no matter what kind of company we work for or what industry we're in.
It's about finding what works for you, but always being open to new ideas.
Exactly. And always remember, building a great company culture is an ongoing process.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right. And it requires constant learning, adaptation, and that willingness to challenge the status quo.
Will said. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, everyone. We hope you found this exploration of Netflix's company culture as fascinating as we did.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep building those amazing company cultures. Until next time, see ya.